Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you today, and my special appreciation for the Center for American Progress for the fabulous work that the Center does and for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I very much look forward to our panel. There's a lot to talk about, but what I thought I would focus my brief remarks on is the convergence of two trends in the world. The trend affecting Russia and its place in the world and the worldview of Vladimir Putin, as well as the trend of the increasing potency of cyber as a weapon. And we saw those trends come into uniquely pernicious combination last November, which will bring us to the heart of the topic today. But let me start out by talking about Russia with an anecdote from a few years ago when I was introduced to a Russian oligarch in Los Angeles and made the observation that it was a shame that Medvedev hadn't been given a freer hand, that I thought relations between the United States and Russia could have been very different, that Putin seemed to have very much a chip on his shoulder, that anything that was in the United States' interest was by definition antithetical to Russia's interest, but that had Putin allowed Medvedev greater autonomy, we might have had a very different relationship and our countries might have been on a very different trajectory, because indeed there were a number of common interests. His answer was very dismissive. Medvedev, he said, was nothing. Do you know, he asked me, that Medvedev had with him at all times someone called the pillow carrier? Do you know what the job of the pillow carrier is? And when I asked him, he said it was the job of the pillow carrier to smother Medvedev in his sleep if he ever did something Putin didn't like. Well, I imagine if I had someone following me around who was a pillow carrier, I wouldn't sleep very well. I don't know how well Mr. Medvedev slept, but tragically, I think Putin's worldview sharpened after the mass protests in 2011 that we've heard a lot about recently because they played such a formative role in his antipathy to Secretary Clinton. But I think it's also an important chapter in modern Russian history because the gravest concern for Vladimir Putin is the longevity of his regime. And the biggest threat that he saw, these mass protests, the color revolutions, and of course the Russians think that the color revolutions, indeed the entire Arab Spring, were inventions of the CIA. When I meet with the CIA, I always congratulate them on their omnipotence to be able to produce these world-changing events. They have far greater capabilities than I'm aware of, but nonetheless, this is apparently the Russian perspective on things. And I used to describe, even as recently as a year ago, the threat emanating from Russia as a form of creeping authoritarianism coming from the Kremlin. I would no longer say it's creeping. I think we are not in a new Cold War, but we are in a highly consequential war of ideas now, not between communism and capitalism, but between authoritarianism and democracy and representative government. And we see that obviously vividly in the Russian propagation of its model, in its desire to tear down the democracies in Europe, to tear down the American democracy. Of course, one of the core conclusions of the intelligence community in terms of Russian interference in our election was the desire to sow discord in the United States. So this is, I think, a hugely important battle of ideas. And sadly, in this battle of ideas, you see autocracy on the march. You see countries in Europe that are becoming increasingly autocratic, increasingly nationalist in their origin. You see changes here in the United States where our own new president displays often very authoritarian qualities. And I think the weakening of Europe, the Brexit, all of these factors, I think, are greatly endangering the future of democracy. And I think this is going to be the struggle of our times. Let me talk now briefly about the other trend, and that is the explosion of the potency of cyber. I think many countries have had a desire to blur the distinctions between different kind of cyber activity. There is obviously cyber for the purpose of theft of intellectual property. This is a problem that we've had with many countries, but probably among the foremost, China, for many years. You have cyber for the purposes of the gathering of foreign intelligence, which all nations that have a cyber capability engage in. You have what we saw very recently in our own election, cyber for the purposes of affecting political outcomes, of meddling in the internal affairs of another country. We have seen this from Russia in Europe in the past. This was the first and most brazen example of cyber being utilized in those means here in the United States. And cyber, tragically, I think for the United States, is a wonderfully asymmetric weapon. It is easy and cheap to go on offense. It is phenomenally difficult and expensive to be on defense. They just need to find an opening. One of the illustrations I love to give is Target. When Target was hacked, apparently the hackers got into Target through the HVAC, the air conditioning system, because in an Internet of Things, you are only as secure as your least vulnerable port of entry, and in that case it was apparently the air conditioning. So in a virtual equivalent of a jewel heist where the thief crawls through the air conditioning duct, the thieves there were able to go through the HVAC system and migrate into the financial data, and then all of a sudden Target had a huge problem on its hands. This is cheap to do. It can be done remotely. It can be done always with some level of deniability. And in the context of a nation-state actor who is doing damage to the United States, whether it's North Korea attacking a company or Russia attacking our democracy, it will always put the administration in a difficult position of proving its case when it makes attribution, or deciding that it can't do so without giving up important sources and methods and making the decision not to attribute conduct. Now, this gets me to, I guess, the point I'd like to conclude on, and that is our new president is doing deep damage to himself and to our country. And he's doing this in many ways. He's doing it in his willingness to make up facts as he goes along, and we are in the midst of the most recent flare-up of the invented facts, the invention that millions of illegal immigrants voted. Why is this significant? What does this have to do with Russia, national security, or anything else? Well, there'll become a time where the president needs to be believed by the country. There will become a time where the president needs to make the case for what the intelligence agencies tell him without revealing what our sources of information are. And if the president can't be believed by his own people, let alone our allies, if the president has so impugned the credibility of the intelligence professionals that are providing the best insights in the world, what hope does he have of persuading his own country, let alone our allies, to make common cause to deal with a threat? This is, I think, an enormous problem. As you may remember, as early as September, Senator Feinstein and I made the unusual decision to go public with attribution of Russia's involvement in the hacking before the administration was willing to. Now, obviously, we were the administration to make attribution. And my argument was that the administration didn't need to reveal sources and methods, but it did need to make attribution. And certainly whenever that's the case, you're going to have people in the public and people in the press saying, where's your proof? But it is going to be very much in our national interest at times for the administration to make attribution and not disclose sources and methods. I'm sure the Kremlin would like nothing better than a more fulsome accounting of how we know just what the Russians were doing. Right now, the Russians are reverse engineering everything in that open source report to try to figure out how do we know what we know. I think it's very important that the president have the confidence of the public to be able to come before the American people and say that either the Iranians are cheating if they're cheating, or the North Koreans are advancing on their miniaturization of a nuclear warhead to fit on an ICBM, or whatever the case may be that warrants action. It's going to be important that that president have credibility. And I think there's no one who's doing more to undermine his own credibility and legitimacy than this president is doing himself. and more in the panel, revisiting the creation of black sites or going back to waterboarding or enhanced interrogation techniques, the consideration of a ban on immigration or visas to Muslims in any form. These are colossal mistakes that will cost us relationships with our allies, many of whom we depend on in the war on terror. And this is a chapter that many of us had hoped we had turned the page on. And I think it would be a tragic mistake for the country to revisit this and make the same mistakes all over again. On that optimistic note, I will conclude, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.